A pleasant morning to everyone. This is Aisa Bunsalagan, your third facilitator for today's session. As we all know, the prior facilitators have gone into the biblical aspects of human work and the prophetic value of Rerum Novarum. At this point, I will be discussing the dignity of work in the eyes of Catholic teachings. Moving on, everyone has its own perspective regarding the significance of human work to begin with. So if you may ask, human work actually has a twofold significance, and these are objective and subjective. In the objective sense, work is the sum of activities, resources, instruments, and technologies used by men and women to produce things and to exercise dominion over the earth. Thus, work in the objective sense constitutes the contingent aspect of human activity, which constantly varies in its expressions according to the changing technological, cultural, social, and political conditions. In simple terms, the objective significance of human work has something to do with what people produce or the type of activity they undertake, and so it varies depending on this fast-paced world. On the contrary, work in the subjective sense is referred to be the activity of human person as a dynamic being capable of performing a variety of actions that are part of the work process and that correspond to his personal vocation, in which man has to subdue the earth and dominate it because as the image of God, he is a person. That is to say, a subjective being capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about himself, and with a tendency to self-realization. As a person, man is therefore the subject of work. Hence, work in the subjective sense represents its stable dimension, since it does not depend on what people produce or on the type of activity they undertake, but only and exclusively on their dignity as human beings. This distinction is critical both for understanding what the ultimate foundation of the value and dignity of work is, and with regard to the difficulties of organizing economic and social systems that respect human rights. Since subjectivity reflects on the dignity of work, it does not allow to be considered as a simple commodity or a common element of the apparatus for productivity. Cut off from its lesser or greater objective value, work is an essential expression of the person. It is an actus personae, a Latin word for personal actions. It follows that the whole person, body, and spirit participates in it, whether it is manual or intellectual work. It is also to the whole person that the word of the living God is directed, the evangelical message of salvation, in which we find many points which concern human work and which throw particular light on it. Accordingly, any form of materialism or economic principle that tries to reduce the worker to being a mere instrument of production and a simple labor force with an exclusively material value would end up hopelessly giving the false impression of the essence of work and clearing it of its most noble and basic human finality. Since the human work is the measure of the dignity of work, there is no doubt that the human work has an ethical value of its own, which clearly and directly remains linked to the fact that the one who carries it out is a person. Therefore, the subjective dimension of work must take precedence over the objective dimension because it is the dimension of the person himself who engages in work, determining its quality and consummate value. If this awareness is lacking, or if one chooses not to recognize this truth, work loses its truest and most profound meaning. In such cases, which are unfortunately all too frequent and widespread, work activity and the very technology employed become more important than the person himself and at the same time are transformed into enemies of his dignity. Take note that the human work not only proceeds from the person, but it is also essentially ordered to and has its final goal in the human person. Independently of its objective content, work must be oriented to the subject who performs it because the end of work always remains man, the subject of work. Even if one cannot ignore the objective component of work with regard to its quality, this component must nonetheless be subordinated to the self-realization of the person, and therefore to the subjective dimension. With that being said, it is possible to affirm that work is for man and not man for work. It is always man who is the purpose of work, whatever work it is that is done by man, even if the common scale of values rates it as the merest service, as the most monotonous, even the most alienating work. Moreover, human work has an intrinsic social dimension. A person's work, in fact, is naturally connected with that of other people. Today, more than ever, work is work with others and work for others. It is a matter of doing something for someone else. The fruits of work offer occasions for exchange, relationship, and encounter. Work, therefore, cannot be properly evaluated if its social nature is not taken into account. Work is also an obligation, that is to say, a duty on the part of man. Man must work both because the Creator has commanded it and in order to respond to the need to maintain and develop his own humanity. Work is presented as a moral obligation with respect to one's neighbor, which in the first place is one's own family, then the society to which one belongs, even further to one's own nation. This is because we are heirs of the work of generations and at the same time shapers of the future of all who will live after us. Furthermore, work confirms the profound identity of men and women created in the image and likeness of God. This implies that men and women are not the owners of human activity in the universe, but those to whom it is entrusted and called to reflect in their own manner of working the image of Him in whose likeness they are made. Now, let's proceed to the relationship between labor and capital. Because of the subjective or personal character of work, it is superior to every other factor connected with productivity. This principle applies in particular with regard to capital. The term capital has different meanings today. Sometimes it indicates the material means of production in a given enterprise. Sometimes the financial resources employed to bring about production or used in stock market operations. One can also speak of human capital to refer to human resources, that is to man himself in his capacity to engage in labor, to make use of knowledge and creativity, to sense the needs of his fellow workers and the mutual understanding with other members of an organization. The term social capital is also used to indicate the capacity of a collective group to work together, the fruit of investments in a mutually binding fiduciary trust. This variety of meanings offers further material for reflecting on what the relationship between work and capital may be today. Of course, the Church's social doctrine has not failed to insist on the relationship between labor and capital, placing in evidence both the priority of the first over the second as well as their complementaries. To strengthen further our understanding to the order of labor and capital, let us understand the following principle. Labor has an intrinsic priority over capital. This principle directly concerns the process of production, and in this process, labor is always a primary efficient cause, while capital, the whole collection of means of production, remains a mere instrument or instrumental cause. This principle is an evident truth that emerges from the whole of man's historical experience. This is part of the abiding heritage of the Church's teaching. However, there must exist a relationship of complementaries between work and capital. The very logic inherent within the process of production shows that the two must mutually permeate one another and that there is an urgent need to create economic systems in which the opposition between capital and labor is overcome. In times when capital and hired labor within a less complicated economic system used to identify with a certain precision not only two elements of production, but also and above all two concrete social classes, the Church affirmed that both were in themselves legitimate. Capital cannot stand without labor, nor labor without capital. This is a truth that applies also today, because it is altogether false to accredit either to capital alone or to labor alone, which is achieved by the joint work of both, and it is utterly unjust that the one should claim unto itself what is being done, denying the effectiveness of the other. In considering the relationship between labor and capital with regard to the impressive transformations of our modern times, we must maintain that the principal resource and the decisive factor at man's disposal is man himself, and that the integral development of the human person through work does not hinder but rather promotes the greater productivity and efficiency of work itself. In fact, the world of work is discovering more and more that the value of human capital is finding expression in the consciences of workers, in their willingness to create relationships, in their creativity, in their industriousness in promoting themselves, in their ability consciously to face new situations, to work together, and to pursue common objectives. These are strictly personal qualities that belong to the subject of work more than to the objective, technical, or operational aspects of work itself. All of this entails a new perspective in the relationship between labor and capital. We can affirm that, contrary to what happened in the former organization of labor, in which the subject would end up being less important than the object and the mechanical process, in our day the subjective dimension of work tends to be more decisive and more important than the objective dimension. The relationship between labor and capital often shows traits of antagonism that take on new forms with the changing of social and economic contexts. In the past, the origin of the conflict between capital and labor was found in the fact that the workers put their powers at the disposal of the entrepreneurs, and these, following the principle of maximum profit, tried to establish the lowest possible wages for the work done by the employees. In our present day, this conflict shows aspects that are new and perhaps more disquieting. Scientific and technological progress and the globalization of markets, of themselves a source of development and progress, expose workers to the risk of being exploited by the mechanisms of the economy and by the unlimited pursuit for productivity. We have to remember that one must not fall into the error of thinking where the process of overcoming the dependence of work on material is of itself capable of overcoming alienation in the workplace or the alienation of labor. This simply means that alienation is found in work when it is organized so as to ensure maximum returns and profits with no concern whether the worker, through his own labor, grows or diminishes as a person, either through increased sharing in a genuinely supportive community or through increased isolation in a maze of relationships marked by destructive competitiveness and estrangement in which he is considered only a means and not an end. Okay, so that concludes my report. I hope that you have gained a bunch of knowledge after listening to this presentation. The next facilitators will dig deeper and will make you discover more about Chapter 6, the human work, so please stay tuned and enjoy learning.